Thank you very much for coming today and joining us here, Heidi and me, from the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism, and the Reverend Jennifer Butler, who is our special guest to talk about this very important topic today. Um, I'm just a couple of housekeeping things. We are going to try to answer as many questions as we can. So you can go ahead if you already know some of your questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A or the chat if that is easier. And then we're going to get to them after we do just a very short presentation. So I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me for one moment. There we go. So today, Global Project released a new report called Faith as a Weapon Inside America's Theocratic Vanguard. We thought it was very important to talk about the role of Christian nationalism and what is happening in our government and our society today, and particularly its impact on the Trump administration. We hope that this will be a really good resource because it's easy to understand the distinct but aligned movements within Christian nationalism. You have Christian nationalism, the New Apostolic Reformation, the Catholic Integralism, and how they're reshaping American conservatism and governance. The package includes descriptions of the Christian nationalist premises like the Seven Mountain Mandate. We have included profiles of Christian nationalists with political power and a glossary of terms because some of these things are kind of difficult to understand. So we hope this will be a really important resource for everybody. A little context, on January 6th, Proud Boys and Oath Keepers received most of the attention, but the Christian nationalist movements provided much of the ideological framework and mobilization for that day. You had Jericho marches around the Capitol, speeches and prayers invoking spiritual warfare, religious leaders casting efforts to overturn the 2020 election as a divine mission. One thing I want to note is that this report is not about Christianity as religion or about the vast majority of Christians. This is only about the minority who want to preference their own view of Christianity over other faiths and impose that biblical worldview on all of us through government policies and legislation. And quickly, we want to thank our experts who helped us with the report, Andre Gagne, Matthew Taylor, and Frederick Clarkson. Oh, here we go. Christian nationalism is a political movement with deliberate strategies to reframe religion to achieve political ends. And with Trump embracing it to achieve his own agenda, he's made this sort of unholy alliance with the Christian nationalists. It's it can be considered one of the most dangerous threats to our liberal and inclusive democracy. And then adding to the complexity of the situation is the fact that many Christian nationalist adherents and sympathizers view Trump as ordained by God. He is a true messianic figure to them, and he is meant to save the country from its current godlessness and restore it as a Christian nation as the founders intended. In other words, you cannot separate being American and being Christian. One thing I know everybody is familiar with Project 2025, but we want to emphasize that Project 2025 is a Christian nationalist blueprint as well as an authoritarian blueprint, and the two can't be disconnected. The current administration is making its way through Project 2025 with alarming efficiency, and many of its authors and contributors hold senior positions within the government. Here are some of them: Russ Vought, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Huckabee, Hegseth. These are all people who are avowed Christian nationalists who believe that that America is meant to be a Christian nation. And then how is it manifesting? These are many of the ways that authoritarianism, how we can see it showing up in our society. But in addition to all that Trump is doing to test and expand the boundaries of the executive branch, and then stacking the courts to get favorable rulings on his authoritarian agenda, some of the most stark implementations of Project 2025 and Christian nationalism ideology have been the attacks on marginalized communities. We've seen it in the cruel way the LGBTQ community has had their rights and humanity stripped from them, the way that women have only just begun to lose their autonomy. Half the women in the country don't have access to reproductive health care. And the next targets, I can assure you, are birth control, no fault divorce, and eventually economic limitations. And of course, people of color are being erased from our history and future economic opportunities. So, what is a Christian nationalist? We use the very good research of PRRI to help us with our report. And in their research, this is how they define Christian nationalism. People, the adherents are people who believe that America should officially be a Christian nation, that all American laws should reflect Christian values, that authentic American identity requires a person to be Christian, and that Christians are divinely mandated to control societal institutions, and any deviation from this threatens our national survival. So in the report, we highlighted these three um, movements. Christian nationalism in general is broad strokes is the belief that America is divinely ordained for Christian rule. It's a Christian supremacist political ideology rooted in bigotry, meaning that when we're talking about religious freedom, we are talking about Christian religious freedom, or when, excuse me, when they're talking about it. The New Apostolic Reformation, it's a loosely organized movement and it's primarily non-denominational and charismatic. It centers on the Seven Mountain Mandate. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. It's a strategic plan to capture the seven institutions of society: family, religion, education, media, entertainment, business, and government. And if you think about it, I'm sure that you all can see how that's happening in different ways. And then Catholic Integralism, which asserts that America should recognize the supremacy of Catholic teaching and ultimately submit to ecclesiastical authority. And this particular far right iteration of Catholicism holds beliefs that are not necessarily in line with mainstream Catholic Church. But one thing to note is that all of these groups reject democracy and insist America should be governed by their vision of God's law rather than through democratic consensus. So what are we talking about in terms of the actual number of people who believe this? If you were to look at what is happening in our government right now, you would think that it is that Trump has really been given a mandate to implement Christian nationalism, but he hasn't. Um, Only 3 in 10 Americans define or categorize themselves as adherents. So that's 10% of the population. If you add in the sympathizers, people who have some belief in Christian nationalism, but not all, that gives you another 20%. So what you're talking about is 30% of people have some um, attachment to Christian nationalism, which is by no means a mandate for our president or for the government. Um, but when you start talking about within that minority of people, most of them believe that Trump has been ordained by God to win the presidential election, that he has a mission on earth. And nearly 4 in 10 of this same minority, and 3 in 10 of people who have some attachment to it, agree that because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence to save the country. Also, about this group of folks who believe in Christian nationalism is that they tend to hold anti-immigrant views, patriarchal understandings of traditional gender roles, which you hear that a lot in terms of family values and how we need to restore family values. political violence, and QAnon beliefs. So that is our presentation. And now we're going to talk a little bit more, have more of a discussion. I want to introduce the Reverend Jennifer Butler, our very special guest today. She's a nationally recognized faith leader, strategist, and author with over 30 years of experience combating religious extremism and defending democracy. She's a leading expert on global Christian nationalism, having written Born Again, the Christian Right Globalized, which was the first book to document the transnational nature of this movement. Also, the founder of Faith in Public Life, mobilized faith leaders to help pass the Affordable Care Act, counter discriminatory religious freedom bills, and resist authoritarianism during the Trump era. She chaired President Obama's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships and led faith engagement for the Harris for President campaign. And she is now leading an international network of faith-based democracy defenders confronting rising authoritarianism around the world, and that is called Faith and Democracy. So thank you very much, Jen, for being here. We look forward to hearing your thoughts. So I want to get started with the first question that I think that will give us context around what's going on today is get your thoughts on a little bit of the history of the Christian right in America, but particularly how it's different today, why what we're experiencing today is different than it was, say, 30 years ago.
Yeah, that is a great question. And first of all, I just want to say congratulations on such a great report. I'm so grateful to the Global Project for its frequent updates on what's happening around the world with extremism. But this report is like one-stop shopping. It's got everything in it that you would need, the glossary, the people, the things to read. So thank you for compiling such a great report. And I continue to learn more because things are changing so fast. So this is not your mama's Christian right, basically. Things have changed quite a bit. Many of us have often thought of the Christian right as, or Christian nationalism as sort of a social conservative movement. But we forget or don't know that the Christian right was actually created by political operatives who wanted to be able to move the South into the Republican Party, Paul Weyrich in particular. And originally, what really galvanized conservative Christians in the South were the efforts to desegregate public schools and the IRS holding accountable private institutions that continued to get tax exemption, but were continuing to discriminate in their charters. So Bob Jones University in particular in 1976 had its charter rescinded, no longer was able to have C3 tax exempt status because it refused to change its mission of discriminating against having Black students. And that is what ignited the Christian right. So the base of it has always been white supremacist, racist, wanting to preserve segregation. And so later, though, as it developed, other issues were kind of brought, and issues like abortion in particular, which originally didn't resonate with a lot of conservative Christians. In fact, the Southern Baptist Convention through the early 70s still had a pro-choice policy, if you look that up. And a lot of the early Protestant leaders were actually some of the early leaders in the pro-choice movement. So as time went on, though, more and more people were brought into the fold under concerns around social issues, LGBTQ and abortion. And so, but remember, always there was this core that had been formed and brought into the Christian right because of its opposition to desegregating society. And so what we see now, especially when Trump became president, is a sort of sorting within the Christian right. Those who saw what Trump was doing as racist, who stood in opposition to his treatment of immigrants, his racist statements, not standing up to what was happening in Charlottesville, saying there were very nice people on both sides when Nazis marched, when there was anti-Semitic and racist sort of activity going on. a lot of conservative Christians left the fold. And so you see the Christian right movement sort of sorting itself. Those who stood up to Trump and to MAGA have now been marginalized. People like David French, for example, the political commentator, who actually I commend to you his recent piece, his op-ed called "The Christian Right is Going Extinct." I think it was in the New York Times, where he talks about this sorting that has gone on, and the fact that he used to think that this theory around the Christian right having been birthed in opposition to desegregating society, he used to, kind of chafe at that, but now he's kind of admitting to, himself that that actually is sort of like the founding story that has really stuck. The other piece that has happened is Trump has really embraced this new Apostolic Reformation that you all really explore in your report. And that is a charismatic movement that uses beliefs around angels and demons and sort of a cosmic battle between good and evil to really intensify the what's at stake in the movement. So if you believe your opponent is actually a demon or possessed by a demon or evil, or the humanity's facing an existential crisis, then of course the stakes are much higher and the propensity for violence is much higher. To give an example of this, I went to a Reawaken America tour, which is one of the many organizations that are part of this new Apostolic Reformation movement. And as it was up in Batavia, New York, and as I walked up the drive to go to this event, which was being held in a tent on a church lawn, there were signs along the roadway leading up to the venue saying, "No guns, no knives." Not one sign, not two signs, but multiple signs reminding people to leave their weapons at the door. And lots of sort of violent imagery and demonic language, and people really sort of whipped into a frenzy. I've been covering the Christian right for a long time, and I've worked to build organizations that elevate a faith voice for justice. And I've never seen this kind of rhetoric deployed. And it was shocking to me just a few years ago to witness that. So I think what we see now is a full out racially motivated, very violent, with a propensity to violent sort of movement in the Christian nationalism that we're seeing today. And things have changed quite a bit.
Yeah, it's quite a bit. Um, One of the things, so we're going to explore this idea of spiritual warfare a little more, but in terms, I want to just jump in just a little bit to see how, or to talk about how Christian nationalism is specifically impacting the current administration and the policies and legislation that we're seeing at the federal level and around the and at the state level, a lot of activity at the state level. So let's get Heidi, why don't you tell us a little bit about how Project 2025 is also a Christian nationalism blueprint, a little bit about who's behind it and how we're seeing it manifest. And then, Jennifer, would love to hear your thoughts too.
Yeah, I'll be happy to start. So, one of the key players on Project 2025, which was a plan for the new administration, an authoritarian plan spearheaded by the Heritage Foundation. But one of the key authors is Russell Vought, who's now in charge of the Office of Management and Budget with Trump. And Wendy showed his picture a little while ago. Several of the people who contributed to the document, I think more than 50, or the organizations that were connected to the plan, are already installed in the administration, right? They have positions in the administration. So there's a direct line between Heritage Foundation plans in Project 2025, Trump executive orders, and the people who are running the government today. And this is notwithstanding the fact that Russell Vought this past weekend told CNN's Dana Bash that there was no relationship between the two agendas, between Trump's agenda and Project 2025, which is just, it's a ridiculous statement. So Christian nationalism is infused throughout the document. And the plan. There are sustained attacks on the rights of the LGBTQ community. Essentially, the document calls for an erasure of that community, which is now happening, right? References to the LGBTQ community removed from government websites, data, related to healthcare and other things for that community disappeared. The head of the Department of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who is a Christian nationalist, is about to change the name of one of the military's ships and strip Harvey Milk's name, right, the gay rights pioneer, from it. Those are sort of surface level attacks, but there are deeper ones on that community, including rescinding a very successful program that protected people from AIDS around the world called PEPFAR. Women, of course, women's reproductive freedom, you already mentioned this, Wendy, is under assault. That is all throughout Project 2025. Abortion rights, and further than that, far further than that, and sort of a restructuring of families into a traditional paternalistic system. But the project goes much deeper than that. It essentially would call for an end to the separation of church and state when it comes to religious freedom principles. It would preference religious people of this faith, the faiths we're talking about, above other people's free speech rights. And one of the main purveyors of Project 2025, this legal outfit called Alliance Defending Freedom, which is very, very anti-LGBTQ, has won these kinds of cases at the Supreme Court. And it shows how far the Supreme Court has actually started to align with Christian nationalist principles. So those are just some of the ways, and maybe Jen, you can add a little bit more.
Yeah, I spent some time with Project 2025. It's what, 900 pages. But one of the things that surprised me is there's some key places in the document, particularly related to the Department of Health and Human Services, where it literally says that its program implementation should be based on scripture. So that is a sea change in terms of the separation of church and state. And it's a version of Christianity that is actually not Christianity, I guess you could say. It's about power, it's about control. If we were actually, I see some questions in the chat, about like what we do about this. If we were actually to base all of these policies on what Christians actually are taught and believe, we would be treating the least of these with kindness. We'd be orienting our policies and our programs and our resources toward helping the marginalized in society. So this is actually, they conflate church and state, but it's all for service of power and control, and it's a version of Christianity that really isn't Christian. That's actually more about how to restore white people to being in power and control in this country. And we see that in the budget fight right now, where they're, wanting to cut Medicaid and healthcare and food stamps, and they racialize that conversation. And so it's very much about like, discriminating against immigrants, getting immigrants out of the country. So the whole conversation around this is very, very racialized and sort of bent on creating an America that is primarily white and is dominated by white people being in charge, and people who have a particular type of Christianity that's actually not really based on scripture. It's more based about power and control and patriarchy.
Yes, and I want to follow up on that. One is to mention, of course, the decimation of DEI initiatives are also highly racialized. And they were also considering getting rid of or changing the name of the ship called Harriet Tubman. So it is quite appalling. But the thing is, this idea of using scripture. The other day, Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, who is a Christian nationalist, who and flies the flag outside of his office, said that he was getting through these budget negotiations because of scripture, and it's you receive the mercy you receive is the mercy you give, or words to that effect, which he takes from scripture. Of course, I think that is ironic, given the policies that he's putting forth and how many people are going to be harmed. But we do see scripture being used all the time to justify some of these very harmful actions. So, Jim, what's your thinking on that as a reverend, as a pastor?
I know. Yeah. Yeah, so I would say faith leaders are really alarmed, at what is happening. And we saw that at the top of the year when Bishop Marion Buddy gave a sermon to Trump about mercy. That is the sum of the Ten Commandments and the law is to love God, love yourself, love your neighbor. We also saw this issue brought up during a debate between J.D. Vance and the Pope. J.D. Vance tried to hijack a Catholic teaching around the order of love and say that, oh, first you love yourself and your family. And then maybe, once you've done that, maybe you extend that to other people, which is a very nationalist argument, right? Like, as those scripture and the Catholic faith teach, you should just be kind to your own kind. No, I mean, look at the teachings of Jesus, the Good Samaritan, the people he was always reaching out to in his ministry. And so the Pope Francis pushed back, and the man who became Pope Leo also pushed back on that, saying, no, we're to follow the parable of the Good Samaritan, which was about reaching out to those in need, no matter their race or ethnicity. And so there have been a lot of interesting public debates trying to reclaim what the faith means. Within my sector of folks who've been organizing against this, there's a campaign called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Just about every organization and denomination I know has a program really trying to help people sort this out so that they don't get captured by Christian nationalist ideas and speaking out really strongly against this administration's policies. Every Monday, Reverend William Barber with the Poor People's Campaign has been holding protests on Capitol Hill to elevate the faith voice around protecting those who are marginalized, those who will be impacted by the budget that is before Congress right now, trying to stop that from happening. And so I think what's really important at this time is to reclaim faith for justice, to make sure people understand what the faith tradition teaches, and to call for that in our elected officials, to do that with respect for all faiths and people who come from secular traditions. But we have moral values that have been espoused by all of our faiths and by our society, that we should work for a society where all people can flourish. And so it's really important at this time that we not let them try to take some sort of moral high ground, because what they're advancing is moral depravity.
And I have to say or ask, how do we how do we encourage people of faith, Christians or any faith, to push back against that, as you say, without demonizing Christians, because that is not the goal. This is not about Christianity. It's about how do we marginalize ourselves or marginalize the people who are pushing these very uninclusive, uh, to say the least, uninclusive policies and legislation.
Yeah. I mean, I think Bishop Buddy did that very well. She was very gentle and humble in her comments to Trump, but she was also very prophetic and very strong, really appealing to the least of these and calling on him to show mercy. I think how we have debates is as important as the debate itself. And so elevating the values that and the vision we want people to aspire to without denigrating, calling people into the struggle instead of pushing people out or calling people out. And sometimes it's easy to resort to that language when we're frustrated, scared, angry. But we need to understand that a lot of people are being led astray. Having grown up in the Bible Belt in the South myself, I've seen friends and families get pulled into some of this disinformation and some of these arguments. And it's really helpful to provide a sort of a story, a logic for people to find their way out through trust and relationships. But I think, it's important that we build coalitions far and wide Currently, I'm working with a lot of Republicans who are non-MAGA Republicans. I'm trying to reach across the aisle to people of no faith, people who are Catholic, evangelical, Buddhist, Hindu, so that we can join hands and organize against what's going on. And I think, that's sometimes what's missing is that because, as a Christian in particular, my faith, I feel like has been hijacked. There have been times where I think my people have been afraid to make an argument based on faith for the policies that we see rooted or inspired by our faith. But I think what we actually need now is to make a values argument, make a religious argument, and one that welcomes everybody and everybody's perspectives, but makes an argument so that people can understand what truly is Christian. So that's why I think the whole world was thrilled when they saw Bishop Buddy's sermon. It went viral. She got, tens of thousands of thank you letters for speaking out in that way. She was among the first to really kind of challenge the Trump administration when people were sort of in shock and quiet. I think what she did was a real model for the world for what we need to do right now. And we can do that while being tolerant of other faiths and different perspectives. But we need to bring that moral critique forward and expose the moral bankruptcy of what this administration and the MAGA movement are trying to do.
That's yes, that is so well said. And I mean, and I have to say that I was, a couple of weeks later, the head of the Episcopal Church completely backed up the bishop, which I think
Yeah,
there was some question as to whether or not that would happen because within big denominations, there's political machinations as well. And it was such that was exactly the kind of leadership I think that
that's right. Well, let me add that happened to be in town the next week after she gave that sermon. And I was with a friend who's not been in church in years. And she said to me, let's go show support for what the bishop did. Let's go worship at the Washington National Cathedral. So we went, and the cathedral was packed. And Bishop Buddy wasn't there. She was doing what she usually does, which is travel throughout the diocese and preach in churches. But the person who was officiating at that service stood up, said a few words about what her ministry is and where she was today, and she received a standing ovation from everybody in the cathedral. So lots of people had come just in honor, of her and what her message was. And what that says to me as a pastor, what I say to a lot of faith leaders is this is part of like you know, evangelization of reaching out, pulling people into a new vision of who we are as a people. There's, I mentioned earlier, the sorting that has happened. A lot of people have left faith traditions, left churches and institutions because of how the Christian right has defined Christianity in the public imagination. So for us, we're realizing that we have to do a lot to reclaim our faith for the sake of people's spiritual health. This is a spiritual crisis in the country. And then it's also a crisis for our democracy, for how we live together and for our stability. So it's important spiritually that we reclaim faith for justice. It's important politically and for how we live together, that we reclaim a moral vision for who we want to be as a people.
yes. Um, all right, so I want to actually come back. I mean, in a couple of minutes, I want to come back to this and what we do about young people, particularly about young men. But
Mhm.
first, Heidi, let's talk for a minute about how Christian nationalism fits into the far right extremist movement in general, how it motivates people, people from groups like the Proud Boys to groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is one of the premier organizations getting a lot of these harmful policies enacted. So, and then how that kind of connects with some of the violence we've seen.
Mhm.
Well, I think one thing about this that's really important to understand is that the Christian nationalist strains that we're talking about here, New Apostolic Reformation, Catholic Integralists, etc., have consolidated throughout the far right conservative movement. So we now have a unifying strand of thinking that didn't really exist not too long ago. In other words, groups like the Heritage Foundation were focused more on economics or other things. I'm not saying they didn't care about social conservative ends, but we didn't have this kind of fusion of Christian nationalism with a policy agenda that's backed by hundreds of organizations and has become such a key part of the Trump administration, right? So allied with Trump and his vision. And it's of course refashioned the GOP seriously, right, with the rise of the MAGA movement. I think one thing that's important here is to remember that this is a minority, but also to understand the relationship to political violence. I think most of us watching the events on January 6th weren't thinking about Christian nationalists playing a key role here. We were thinking about the kind of shock troops that were at the front of invading the Capitol, meaning the white supremacists like the Proud Boys, the militia groups like the Oath Keepers. But the bulk of that crowd was actually featuring Christian nationalist symbols, coming out of this movement. There had already been, Jericho marches to reclaim government buildings. This didn't get a whole lot of play. And
I,
that day, yeah,
I want to interrupt you just for a minute to remind people that we have a glossary of terms in our report and maybe just mention what a Jericho march is.
yeah, I didn't know much about this actually until very recently. It's essentially a religious rite in which you claim buildings or sites for gods by marching around them, right? So like you're taking them back from the demons, you're expelling the demons inside the structure or the location. And that was happening on January 6th. And while many of us were focusing on these very violent groups like the Proud Boys, the bulk of that crowd was not Proud Boys and militiamen. It was folks coming from the Christian nationalist movement who had come to believe that Trump's election was stolen through all the election denialism, which was pumped out by organizations connected to Christian nationalist groups or individuals. And that fueled the violence of that day. So there's a direct relationship between political violence to stop the certification of the election, in other words, undermine our democracy, and the Christian nationalist movement. And that is really important and that is relatively new. Some other things about Christian nationalist groups and political violence, the rampant acceptance of QAnon conspiracy theories in this population. And QAnon is a movement, this is this crazy movement that, Democrats and Hollywood actors are involved in child trafficking, and the deep state is trying to undermine Donald Trump. This is a movement that the FBI, not too long ago said was directly related to violence. In other words, many people involved in QAnon have been involved in violent acts. So you have that connection as well, and those conspiracies. And, we have to think that these conspiracies about the deep state are at the heart of gutting the federal government, the actions taken by Elon Musk and Doge and stuff that's in Project 2025. There's also a high level of acceptance in this community of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which is a white supremacist idea that somehow white people are being displaced by non-white immigrants and refugees in their home countries, and this has to be reversed. This is part of the racism that Jen was talking about in the movement. And we know that just a few days ago, the State Department under Marco Rubio has put forward a plan to create an Office of Remigration. That term, which means ethnic cleansing of non-white people from various countries, that term was created by a former neo-Nazi and white supremacist in Europe. So there is another connection there. And of course, anytime we talk about ethnic cleansing, that's quite terrifying, and the treatment of immigrants in this country. And none of us should be surprised that the only immigrants that are being allowed in are white South Africans who are supposedly facing racial violence in that country. Those have become the refugees for this administration. And that's something that's completely accepted by all these anti immigrant extremists in the Christian nationalist groups behind Project 2025.
This is such a big subject. It's giant. And we are covering just a small part of it today. And so I want to say, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And also, if for some reason we don't get to something that you wanted answered, you can always email us and we will try to get you an answer. Let me I'm going to go back to, well, let me talk for just a second or ask y'all about how the Trump administration or Trump himself is co-opting faith in to bolster his own messianic image and to give the idea that he is a true believer. For example, having Paula White Cain in his office of faith. Heidi, tell us a little bit about Paula White Cain, and then Jen, I would love to hear your thoughts about the differences in how one reaches people.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's the nice way to say it, Heidi.
Well, I'll just point folks to in our report we have profiles of these figures that are either in the Trump administration that come from these strands of far right Christian movements, and folks that are closely aligned with the administration, advise the administration. Paula White Cain is Trump's sort of personal spiritual leader. She has some pretty extreme beliefs related to things like spiritual warfare that we discussed here. It's really kind of surprising that an office of faith
Oh,
is.
there you are. Okay.
Did I disappear or something?
You
Oh,
froze for a minute. I think
uh,
we all did.
yeah, it says, sorry, my internet is a little unstable. Anyhow, it's the people who are in the Trump White House representing quote unquote faith communities or Christianity are very, very far from what I think most Christians believe or think Christianity is. And it's just once again an example of how there's been a capture of the Trump administration by these far right figures, as opposed to what the bulk of Christians are really about.
Yeah, and of course Paula White Cain she has a prosperity uh ideology, meaning that if you are faithful enough, then you will be enriched materially. That's just a short, condensed version of it. What do you think, Jen?
Yeah, I call that casino Christianity. You put your money in and you get, big results back. And that's not exactly what Jesus was all about. In fact, he said, leave your cloak and come follow me. And it's so antithetical to everything, that's taught in our scripture. And so, I think it's interesting how Trump also uses, so he's sort of this, they make him out to be a messianic figure. You see these pictures of him with Paula White Cain and others around him with their hands on him, praying over him. And he's sometimes looking straight at the camera while their heads are bowed, which is the most frightening of the images that I see. At the same time, they give him a level of plausible deniability. They say, God raises up leaders who are a little rough around the edges sometimes and not all perfect, but they're tough guys that are sometimes needed to sort of restore the rightful place of Christendom, And so they call him, liken him to King Cyrus in the Bible, who worked God's will, but was not, of the fold. And so they kind of play both sides. He's kind of messianic in some ways, a Christ-like figure when he was nearly, shot or assassinated in Pennsylvania. They kind of made that up to be like sort of a martyrdom moment. But at the same time, he's, clearly doesn't live up to a lot of Christian principles in his own life. And so they give him a level of sort of pass on that. So in that way, it's very cult-like, this whole thing. You have this kind of cultish figure that people feel like is speaking for them and playing really satisfying their fears around the rapid changes within society, I think. And I think, that just means that those of us too who are in communities that can reach out and inoculate people against this or pull them back from the brink, our work is super important. I want to elevate a couple of groups that are doing that within evangelical communities. They recognize that there's a problem with in particular, young men getting radicalized online and getting pulled into ministries like Charlie Kirk's ministry. If you ever watch him online, he's a young, sort of muscular Christian trying to, defend white Christians. And he's extremely racist, sexist, very overt about what he's doing. And so there's one effort called Disarming Leviathan, led by Caleb Campbell. He was featured on a podcast called When the Wolves Came. I highly recommend listening to that podcast because he talks about, and I see some of the questions here in the webinar chat around how do we navigate this conversation with people we love. I see Kristen Bell is asking that question. Caleb Campbell is a model for that. His book, Disarming Leviathan, that podcast talks about his ministry to do just that. He and his colleague are trying to launch a ministry to sort of de-radicalize people through online ministries and means, which I think is very much needed. There's another evangelical group called the American Values Coalition. David French launched something called the After Party. These are all efforts to reach out within conservative white evangelical communities and pull people back from the brink and inoculate them, particularly young people that are starting to get pulled into this. So I think it's very important to do. I think we need to recognize that part of the problem that we face is that there is a ton of money going into radicalizing people. And the intent behind that is to remove all regulations so that greed can run rampant. There's a great book by Catherine Stewart that I think you quote in your resource, Money, Lies, and God. And she talks about the people who have financed this radicalization of Christian nationalism and Christians, really around the world now. And so, I think it's important that those who can support these kinds of ministries, like Christians Against Christian Nationalism, like Disarming Leviathan, who are trying to de-radicalize people and give them information they need to not act based on their fears, but to act based on the compassion that their faith has taught them.
I think that's, I mean, what you're talking about is what everybody is that wants to make sure that we protect our democracy, protect our people is talking about. How do you reach the people that are not just like you? How do you I mean, how does a non-believer talk to a believer and vice versa? How do we sort of bridge that polarization? And that is a huge, huge question. I think that the answer, there is no huge answer. It is the everyday stuff. One question that we're seeing, I mean, it's been asked a couple of times in the Q&A. It is about the big organized denominations, including the Roman Catholic Church.
Mhm.
What is the responsibility of, like the Methodist Church and the various factions of Baptist, Southern Baptist, and on, and is there a hesitation within the leadership of these denominations to do what you're suggesting? And
Mhm.
it's not necessarily because they don't believe what you believe.
Mhm. I think there has at times been a lot of fear within denominations because, and here's the untold story, the Christian right very early on started to polarize our denominations. So, for example, my first Presbyterian General Assembly, I worked for the Presbyterian denomination in the peacemaking program. So I was at my very first General Assembly where we set our policies, and the Christian right had spent $100,000 on a war room to reverse our policies around gender justice and to get rid of some of our staff positions around that. The next year, when I went to our next General Assembly, I literally got physically ill just walking in the assembly hall because I'd been through so much the very first time I'd been to one. And so, um, I think what we don't realize is that there's been a lot of money spent just to tear down our denominational structures and to keep us frozen and fearful of the very future of our institutions. I think a lot of that may be starting to melt away because of the leadership of people like Miriam Buddy, because of the stakes being so high, because we realize now that if we don't staunch the flow and the increasing violence now, then we will be subsumed by that. Like I mentioned earlier how many people have left religious institutions because they've considered Christianity bigoted and intolerant, when really Christianity is all about resisting tyranny. It's a liberative tradition that talks about setting slaves free and proclaiming the year of God's favor and freeing the oppressed. And so, part of my work has really been to help people feel more bold in speaking out because that's important for the sake of the continuance of our institutions and our faith. And it's important for our democracy and for the sake of the world and peace and stability everywhere. And so we all need to be speaking out. We all need to be organizing and doing what we can in our communities to build community and to pull people back from the polarization that is coming at them.
It's going to take everybody in their everyday lives
It
to
is.
make to address this. Um, okay, well, we only have a couple of minutes left, and I just Heidi, can you talk like for a couple of minutes about what we can expect to see coming from the Trump administration as it relates to Christian nationalism implementation and Project 2025?
Well, I think that there's a Project 2025 tracker online that shows something like 40+% of the
Mm.
plan has already been instituted. We had the horrific situation yesterday where the Trump administration rescinded some advice for emergency medical situations involving pregnant people. There had been deaths where people wouldn't provide abortions where somebody needed them. Before Biden put that advice through, it was just repealed. That's going to mean more maternal deaths for sure, and unfortunately. I expect that the plan will continue to be enacted as it's laid out. So, we will continue to see whatever's left of, for example, medical research around the LGBTQ community gone and stopped. We will also, though, and this is the part that's, not necessarily related to civil rights, we will just see programs gutted. When the head of FEMA says he doesn't know we have a hurricane season, that's quite frightening. All climate action disappeared because that does not align with this particular religious viewpoint. I think a lot of people don't understand that not only do Christian nationalists are waging a full scale assault on democracy and civil rights, but it's also true of the environment. There are economic implications. One of the things that Project 2025 wants to allow happen is children going back to work. I mean, child labor laws, they want to rescind those. So I'm expecting these things to happen, and some of those things have already happened at the state level, right? In Florida, for example, where they've loosened up child labor laws. And this will continue to be the assault on our academic institutions because they are viewed as opposed to Christian nationalist beliefs, opposed to Project 2025, opposed to the Trump administration. So there's a general tearing down of institutions across the board. And that will continue to happen.
Yeah, it's going to. And we didn't even have a chance today to talk about sort of how the all the different agencies are being dismantled in pursuit of this agenda. For example, the Department of Education and all that it entails. But we'll just have to have another webinar on all the different agencies. Um, and so Jen, would you like to give like a couple of inspirational words?
Can I jig us back from the brink of depression and paralysis?
Yeah.
Um, I mean, ultimately, I draw strength from solidarity with others. And so I would encourage people out there to lock arms with somebody in your community that feels the same way. I see some great comments in here about people who are organizing with Indivisible or, wanting more resources to organize. Ultimately, my faith teaches me that hope is all about understanding the vision that we're working for. And even though we don't know what's coming at us in the days and weeks ahead, we do know that that God is always calling us toward a world where everyone flourishes. And in my view, God is very much present and helping us through that and helping us move into the vision that is lifted up in Scripture, where everybody is created in God's image. I think people draw strength in various ways, but I think our values are so critical at this point in time to lift up. As Heidi said, they're really all about flipping over the institutions that have upheld our views of inclusivity, of pluralism, of dignity for all. And I have to believe that when we build broad coalitions, that ultimately what people want is that kind of world where there, is no violence and where people are loved and cherished. And so I think our vision for humanity is a lot more compelling, and we need to get out there and communicate it and build alliances with people locally that can help us move forward, and we will get there. The other thing that encourages me as I look forward is I think about the people who fought abolition, who fought Jim Crow. Think about that moment. I think of all the heroes, Sojourner Truth. Who would have ever thought that they could reverse such a lucrative thing as the slave trade, or reverse, the Jim Crow South? They had the vision to know that that was the right thing to do and to continue and to commit to it, not even knowing what the outcome would be, not even knowing if they would see the outcome in their lifetime. But there is joy in that struggle of working for the right outcome, and look what it brought about. In some ways, those times were darker and seemed even more impossible than what we face now. So we can and we will get where we need to be.
Thank you very much for that. Tell everybody where they can follow you and your work.
Yeah, so I'm most of my handles are Rev Jen Butler. So whether that's Twitter or Instagram, I have a Substack called Reclaim Faith, and I write there a lot about spiritual practices that can help you get through these times. And I try to be interfaith in that expression. So come join me there as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Um,
so much.
yeah, so we want to thank everybody who joined us today. I think this has been a great discussion. At least I hope it has been for y'all. And we see some requests to do some more on this topic, and there's a lot more to talk about. So we will try to get some of that scheduled. And follow us, Global Extremism, at Global Extremism. That's what we are on all the platforms too. All right. Thanks very, very much. Bye bye.
Bye.